The Battle of Fredericksburg was fought December 11 to 15, 1862, in and around Fredericksburg, Virginia, between General Robert E. Lee's Confederate Army of Northern Virginia and the Union Army of the Potomac, commanded by Major General Ambrose Burnside. The Union Army's futile frontal attacks on December 13 against entrenched Confederate defenders on the heights behind the city is remembered as one of the most one-sided battles of the American Civil War, with Union casualties more than twice as heavy as those suffered by the Confederates. Burnside's plan was to cross the Rappahannock River at Fredericksburg in mid-November and race to the Confederate capital of Richmond before Lee's army could stop him. Bureaucratic delays prevented Burnside from receiving the necessary pontoon bridges in time, and Lee moved his army to block the crossings. When the Union Army was finally able to build its bridges and cross under fire, urban combat in the city resulted on December 11-12. Union troops prepared to assault Confederate defensive positions south of the city and on a strongly fortified ridge just west of the city known as Mary's Heights. On December 13, the Grand Division of Maj. Gen. William B. Franklin was able to pierce the first defensive line of Confederate Lieutenant General Stonewall Jackson to the south, but was finally repulsed. Burnside ordered the Grand Divisions of Maj. Gens. Edwin V. Sumner and Joseph Hooker to make multiple frontal assaults against Lt. Gen. James Longstreet's position on Mary's Heights, all of which were repulsed with heavy losses. On December 15, Burnside withdrew his army, ending another failed Union campaign in the Eastern Theater. Background and Burnside's plan. In November 1862, U.S. Confederate armies had been on the move earlier in the fall, invading Kentucky and Maryland, and although each had been turned back, those armies remained intact and capable of further action. Lincoln urged Maj. Gen. Ulysses S. Grant to advance against the Confederate stronghold of Vicksburg, Mississippi. He replaced Maj. Gen. Don Carlos Buell with Maj. Gen. William S. Rosecrans, hoping for a more aggressive posture against the Confederates in Tennessee, and on November 5, seeing that his replacement of Buell had not stimulated Maj. Gen. George B. McClellan into action, he issued orders to replace McClellan in command of the Army of the Potomac in Virginia. McClellan had stopped Robert E. Lee at the Battle of Antietam in Maryland, but had not been able to destroy Lee's army, nor did he pursue Lee back into Virginia aggressively enough for Lincoln. McClellan's replacement was Maj. Gen. Ambrose E. Burnside, the commander of the Ninth Corps. Burnside had established a reputation as an independent commander, with successful operations earlier that year in coastal North Carolina and, unlike McClellan, had no apparent political ambitions. However, he felt himself unqualified for Army-level command and objected when offered the position. He accepted only when it was made clear to him that McClellan would be replaced in any event and that an alternative choice for command was Maj. Gen. Joseph Hooker, whom Burnside disliked and distrusted. Burnside assumed command on November 7. In response to prodding from Lincoln and General-in-Chief Maj. Gen. Henry W. Halleck, Burnside planned a late fall offensive. He communicated his plan to Halleck on November 9. The plan relied on quick movement and deception. He would concentrate his army in a visible fashion near Warrenton, feigning a movement on Culpeper Courthouse, Orange Courthouse, or Gordonsville. Then he would rapidly shift his army southeast and cross the Rappahannock River to Fredericksburg, hoping that Robert E. Lee would sit still, unclear as to Burnside's intentions, while the Union Army made a rapid movement against Richmond, south along the Richmond, Fredericksburg and Potomac Railroad from Fredericksburg. Burnside selected this plan because he was concerned that if he were to move directly south from Warrenton, he would be exposed to a flanking attack from Lt. Gen. Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson, whose corps was at that time in the Shenandoah Valley south of Winchester. He also believed that the Orange and Alexandria Railroad would be an inadequate supply line, while Burnside began assembling a supply base at Falmouth, near Fredericksburg. The Lincoln administration entertained a lengthy debate about the wisdom of his plan, which differed from the president's preference of a movement south on the O&A and a direct confrontation with Lee's army instead of the movement focused on the city of Richmond. Lincoln reluctantly approved the plan on November 14 but cautioned his general to move with great speed, certainly doubting that Lee would react as Burnside anticipated. Opposing forces. Union Burnside organized his Army of the Potomac into three so-called Grand Divisions, organizations that included infantry corps, cavalry, and artillery, comprising 120,000 men, of whom 114,000 would be engaged in the coming battle. The Right Grand Division, commanded by Maj. Gen. Edwin V. Bull Sumner, consisted of the 2nd Corps of Maj. Gen. Darius N. Couch and the 9th Corps of Brig. Gen. Orlando B. Wilcox. A cavalry division under Brig. Gen. Alfred Pleasanton was attached. The Center Grand Division, commanded by Maj. Gen. Joseph Hooker, consisted of the 3rd Corps of Brig. Gen. George Stoneman and the 5th Corps of Brig. Gen. Daniel Butterfield. A cavalry brigade under Brig. Gen. William W. Averell was attached. The Left Grand Division, commanded by Maj. Gen. William B. Franklin, consisted of the 1st Corps of Maj. Gen. John F. Reynolds and the 6th Corps of Maj. Gen. William F. Baldy Smith. A cavalry brigade commanded by Brig. Gen. George D. Bayard was attached. The reserve, commanded by Maj. Gen. Franz Sigel of the 11th Corps, was in the area of Fairfax Courthouse. The 12th Corps, under Maj. Gen. Henry W. Slocum, was called from Harper's Ferry to Dumfries, Virginia, to join the reserve force on December 9. But none of these troops participated in the battle. Confederate Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia had nearly 85,000 men, with 72,500 engaged. His organization of the Army in Corps was approved by an act of the Confederate Congress on November 6, 1862. The 1st Corps of Lt. Gen. James Longstreet included the divisions of Maj. Gens. Lafayette McLaws, Richard H. Anderson, George E. Pickett, and John Bell Hood, and Brig. Gen. Robert Ransom, Jr. The 2nd Corps of Lt. Gen. Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson included the divisions of Maj. Gens. D.H. Hill and A.P. Hill, and Brig. Gens. Jubal A. Early and William B. Taliaferro. Reserve artillery under Brig. Gen. William N. Pendleton. The cavalry division under Maj. Gen. J.E.B. Stewart. The two armies at Fredericksburg represented the largest number of armed men that ever confronted each other for combat during the Civil War. Movement to battle. The Union Army began marching on November 15, and the first elements arrived in Falmouth on November 17. Burnside's plan quickly went awry. He had ordered pontoon bridges to be sent to the front and assembled for his quick crossing of the Rappahannock, but because of administrative bungling, the bridges did not arrive on time. Burnside first requisitioned the pontoon bridging on November 7 when he detailed his plan to Halleck. The plan was sent to the attention of Brig. Gen. George Washington Cullom, the Chief of Staff in Washington. Plans called for both riverine and overland movement of the pontoon trains to Falmouth. On November 14, the 50th New York Engineers reported the pontoons were ready to move, except for a lack of the 270 horses needed to move them. Unknown to Burnside, most of the bridging was still on the upper Potomac. Communications between Burnside's staff engineer Cyrus B. Comstock and the Engineer Brigade Commander Daniel P. Woodbury indicate that Burnside had assumed the bridging was en route to Washington, based on orders given on November 6. As Maj. Gen. Edwin V. Sumner arrived, he strongly urged an immediate crossing of the river to scatter the token Confederate force of 500 men in the town and occupying the commanding heights to the west. Burnside became anxious, concerned that the increasing autumn rains would make the fording points unusable and that Sumner might be cut off and destroyed, ordering Sumner to wait in Falmouth. Lee at first anticipated that Burnside would beat him across the Rappahannock and that to protect Richmond, he would assume the next defensible position to the south, the North Anna River. But when he saw how slowly Burnside was moving, he directed all of his army toward Fredericksburg. By November 23, all of Longstreet's corps had arrived and Lee placed him on the ridge known as Mary's Heights to the west of town, with Anderson's division on the far left, McLaws directly behind the town, and Pickett's and Hood's to the right. He sent for Jackson on November 26. But his Second Corps commander had anticipated the need and began force-marching his troops from Winchester on November 22, covering as many as 20 miles a day. Jackson arrived at Lee's headquarters on November 29 and his divisions were deployed to prevent Burnside crossing downstream from Fredericksburg. D.H. Hill's division moved to Port Royal, 18 miles downriver, Early's 12 miles downriver at Skinker's Neck, A.P. Hill's at Thomas E. B's House, Beaver, about 6 miles southeast of town, and Taliaferro's along the RF&P Railroad, 4 miles south at Guinea Station. The boats and equipment for a single pontoon bridge arrived at Falmouth on November 25. Much too late to enable the Army of the Potomac to cross the river without opposition. Burnside still had an opportunity, however, because by then he was facing only half of Lee's army, not yet dug in, and if he acted quickly, he might have been able to attack Longstreet and defeat him before Jackson arrived. Once again he squandered his opportunity. The full complement of bridges arrived at the end of the month, but by this time Jackson was present and Longstreet was preparing strong defenses. Burnside originally planned to cross his army east of Fredericksburg at Skinker's Neck, but an advance movement by Federal gunboats to there was fired upon and drew Early's and D.H. Hill's divisions into that area, a movement spotted by Union balloon observers. Now assuming that Lee had anticipated his plan, Burnside guessed that the Confederates had weakened their left and center to concentrate against him on their right, so he decided to cross directly at Fredericksburg. On December 9, he wrote to Halleck, "I think now the enemy will be more surprised by a crossing immediately in our front than any other part of the river. I'm convinced that a large force of the enemy is now concentrated at Port Royal, its left resting on Fredericksburg, which we hope to turn, in addition to his numerical advantage in troop strength." Burnside also had the advantage of knowing his army could not be attacked effectively. On the other side of the Rappahannock, 220 artillery pieces had been located on the ridge known as Stafford Heights to prevent Lee's army from mounting any major counterattacks.